Hello, my friend. Welcome to another episode of the DMD podcast. We have been diving into a series of episodes and interviews about parenting, about specific types of parenting. We've been talking about raising boys, raising girls, raising kids with disabilities, raising athletes, raising all types of children, because as dads, we navigate these things every day. And I know there's a lot of questions. Well, today is another conversation about parenting and specific parenting and parenting children with autism. My guest today is Andrea Pollack. I thought it'd be great to bring Andrea on because Andrea has a depth of experience when it comes to helping raise kids with autism. Andrea was practicing law for 19 years, but left that career to homeschool her autistic son when she was unable to find a school that he could thrive in. And after nearly 8 years of homeschooling, Andrea's son returned to a mainstream school. But instead of returning to her law career, Andrea wanted to share her knowledge and experience that she had with her own son with other parents. So she returned to school herself and earned a master's degree in education. After that, Andrea has started Autism Parent Solutions. And this is to help educate, support, and empower parents to help their autistic children reach their highest potential. This is another powerful conversation. Whether you have a child with autism or not, this is a great conversation about how kids learn. This is an important piece of parenting, important piece of being a dad, making a difference is being able to educate, connect with, and help grow your kids. This episode on the DMD podcast with Andrea Pollack starts right now. Andrea, welcome to the Dad's Making a Difference podcast. Great to see you today.
Great to see you too. Thank you for having me.
Of course. I have learned over the last year and a half of doing this show that there's so much value in various perspectives. And at first, I have to be honest, at first I was like, oh, Dad's Making a Difference. We'll have all male guests. And some of my best guests, if not most of them, have been females. And so I'm so thankful that you're open to coming on our platform and on our show to speak to the dads and the wives listening to this about your area of expertise. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. I'm really excited about your whole platform, the whole topic. I love that you have a group of dedicated dads wanting to make a difference. What a great thing.
Thank you. It's interesting because I have conversations with fathers, and a lot of it is about raising kids and different stages. You know, my kids are young, 9 and 12. You just shared a little bit about insight of what you have coming up in your life with your kids. And everybody's in different stages, but there's similar questions. And something that has popped up recently in several conversations that I've had with dads, which I thought was so important for you to come on and to talk to, was raising children who are neurodivergent, specifically in the areas of children with autism or ADHD. And I know a little bit about your story, but I would love for you to dive into a little bit about your story, your background, because it's a non-traditional route to teaching people about this. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I was a lawyer for 19 years. I was a litigator. And I decided to leave that career when my son was 4. And he was in a school environment and he just was not thriving. And we looked around for other schools. And, you know, at the time there was much less available. He's now 25. So this was quite a while ago.
Yeah.
So I made what felt like was, I guess, partially a hard decision because I had so much invested in my career. But on the other hand, he only has one mom, and that was clear to me what I needed to do. So I then proceeded to homeschool him for 8 years, which was not my plan on the way in. I had no idea it was going to last that long. And after, during the 8th year, I realized he was ready to return to school. So we proceeded to look around again. And I decided it would be really criminal for me to go back to practicing law, when I had just invested 8 years of my life attacking it like, a Wall Street lawyer. And, that it was such a shame that each of us, because it can be a very isolating existence, that each of us learns so much through raising our children and then takes it with us. Yeah. So that's when I decided I really had to share my knowledge with other parents. I went back to school, got my master's in education, and started Autism Parent Solutions.
That's amazing. Would you be open to sharing a little bit about what it was like raising your son when you first realized like this system that he's put into, this plug and play system, is not working for him? And what were some of the insights that you gained along the way that kind of made that clear to you?
Yeah, well, it was interesting. He developed quite typically up until two, a little over two,
Mm.
and then he regressed. And I know there's a lot of controversy over whether regression really exists. I can tell you, in my son's case, it was pretty clear.
Yeah.
Um, and because he had been so typical, um, watching him start to struggle with his sensory system, and his language emerged, and then he lost it all.
Mm.
And so, we had him in a school, and the school was great for other kids. I don't want to disparage the school in any way. It just was too overwhelming for him. And I felt that what they were teaching him wasn't at the core of his challenge. They were teaching him at age 3. I understand why they were teaching him names of things and to identify objects. And I thought, this child needs to relate and communicate and feel warmth. And so I don't know. Inside, it just felt all wrong. I don't know that I can explain it any
Yeah.
more cogently than that.
Yeah, parental intuition. You just know, and sometimes people will get asked that. And I thank you for being open and just kind of thinking about that for a second. I kind of put you on the spot there. But some people will think, well, how did you know? Well, I'm their parent. I just know. And I can't quantify it, but you got to trust me that I knew something was different and I needed to take a different step. And I love that you said that in your journey, that you were doing law and you knew that as a mom, you needed to do something different and you did it for your kid. But then the best part about this, it wasn't just about your son. You started to make it about everyone's children and other people who are experiencing the same thing. So I think that's incredible. Um, what was that transition like for you? What was the transition like for you going from mom diving in, homeschooling my own son, because this is what I think he needs, to now I'm working with other people and their kids?
It was a pretty seamless transition in some ways because I had spent so much time learning. And then I became someone who people sought out for help.
Mm.
And I realized I had already been doing it to some extent in a very informal way. So in that way, it was seamless. But also, when I first started my law career, I was, completely out of my comfort zone. And then, I changed jobs within my law career and was out of my comfort zone. And then I homeschooled my child. I had no idea what I was doing when I first started. So I think I developed resilience with respect to being outside of my comfort zone.
That's great. So then you started your working with families with children with autism. Where has that led you, and what have some of the things been that you've learned along the way that you could share with the guys who are listening to this right now?
Sure. Well, part of why I felt so passionate about sharing what I had learned with so many parents is because, the universe out there is really complex. There are all different kinds of therapies and all different kinds of interventions. And you can go down a rabbit hole every night on Google and come out more confused than you went in. And what I discovered while I was homeschooling him, and this isn't about schooling, this is about parenting. I want to be clear about that. That there are a few general principles that if you understand them, you keep them in mind, and you work with them, you can figure out almost everything.
Right. Well, I'm going to ask, what
What
are
are
some
they?
of the, yeah, what are they?
Yeah.
Because, as a dad, I'm watching my kids grow right now. My nieces, my nephews, and there's neurodivergence in our family. And so what are some of these general principles that we can keep an eye out for?
Sure. Well, the first thing is really, I help parents really understand what self-regulation and dysregulation are, because
Mm.
we're not taught that. And we can
Yeah.
see something going on, but we don't always have the language for it and the full understanding of what's going on. Also, we get triggered. And so here we are, we're really requiring our children to exercise more self-control, but when we're triggered, it's very hard for us to do that. So we really just break it down and bring awareness to parents to what they're doing. Like some parents will initially say, I just can't help it. I'm just a yeller. And I say, I totally understand why you feel that way because it's a habit. And we can look at that and we can help you break that habit. And I can give you tools to work with. And let's see if, what that change looks like. And there's always a change. Like we know that yelling at our kids is not helpful. So really focusing on all the definitions and understanding. And it's really the beginning of really understanding what's going on with your child, what their actions are telling us. And then the next one that's so important is setting your child up for success. Because so many times we try to teach through, correction, right? Or even punishment or discipline, and the child, it's not an opportunity for the child to learn the skills that they're missing or to meet the need that was unmet that caused the behavior. So really teaching parents how to see exactly where their child is, and then from there, how to stretch them. This isn't about reducing expectations overall. This is about really guiding your child to meet those higher expectations, stepping stone by stepping stone.
I love these two principles right now. First, that regulation piece. It sounds like it's more self-regulation for adults than it is for kids.
Well, it does really start there. Yeah.
Yeah. And understanding that situation that you're in as you're navigating these interactions with your children. And then the setting up for success, that ties right into that. How do we put ourselves in a position where we aren't looking for compliance and we're not operating from a lens of punishment and do this or else, especially in a case where a child might be viewing that situation a little bit differently than we would expect.
Absolutely.
I love that you said a need that was not met. Can we dig into that for a second?
Sure.
What are some of the needs in the families that you've worked with? What are some of the needs that are going unmet with some of these neurodivergent learners, kids, that you've seen pop up, and how can we be aware of what we need to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about unmet needs in the moment. I wouldn't say there are global issues. It's more, your child had a really overstimulating day for his or her sensory system. And then they have a meltdown at night in response to something that is it's so out of proportion to what seems to have caused it.
Yeah.
And you look at your child, and sometimes parents are like, he should be able to do better. And I help them see, like, actually, he shouldn't. And we know that because he isn't, right? We start with the presumption that there's a reason why this is happening, and it's not willfulness, right?
Yeah.
There's an unmet need. It could be they're tired, they're hungry. It could be they needed more attention than they got that day. It could be, a big topic is homework. Parents have such a hard time. There's so much conflict over homework. And maybe they can't articulate it, but just the idea of doing that much homework sets them off. So the unmet need there might be, it really needed to be chunked down for them to put it into accessible bite-sized units. I hope those examples are what you're looking for.
Excellent. Excellent. Because I'm just reflecting on some experiences that I've had. I shared with you on our pre-call that, I've been in education for 17 years and worked a lot with students, students with autism, ADHD, all of this. And there's times where as an adult, I'm like, oh, I could feel my frustration grow because I could see that this young child was struggling in the moment to process what was happening. And I just had to remind myself, if they could, they would.
Yes.
So what do I need to change right now about me so that I can help benefit them? And I think as parents and as learners ourselves, that's a hard thing for us to do because we think we kind of have it figured out or should have it figured out.
Yeah, and there's so much fear bundled in there. You don't even realize you're operating from fear, but there's, you have a bad day and you're like, oh my goodness, it's never going to be different. He's never going to be able to do X, Y, Z. And then that causes you additional dysregulation, which makes it harder to help you regulate. I always tell my parents, we want to think about it as allowing our children to borrow our calm, right? So
I like that. Borrow our calm.
yeah. so an extra reminder of why it's so important to stay calm. But also, I talk about bedtime with parents a lot. You get to bedtime, and bedtime can be bedlam. But as parents, we can be on our last nerve also, right? So
Right.
it's really about just bringing much more intentionality and awareness to what's going on. And when things go wrong, what can I do differently tomorrow? Like just
Yeah.
really being scientific and methodical about it almost.
I like that. Man, I'm going to challenge, if you're listening to this right now, I want you to challenge yourself and think about how many times in your home everything's great till about 7:30 at night, and then from 7:30 to 7:45, when it's like time to get ready for bed, your tone changes, the kid's tone changes. Now you're frustrated, and it's like, well, like 12 minutes ago everything was good. Like, what happened here? uh we do
Yes.
that in our home. I have to reflect on that too. I love that borrow our calm. um, we're the adult in that situation, but I know that there's lots of times where adults struggle with that because, like you said, there's this fear of not knowing what to do.
Can I just add one
Yeah,
thing to that
absolutely.
though? That when we talk about that, when I talk about that, it's not about not feeling the feelings, right? I want
Mm,
parents to feel all the feelings. This isn't about suppressing your feelings,
yeah,
because that if you do that all the time every day, that doesn't go to a good place either. It's
right.
about in the moment prioritizing their need over your need to express and process those feelings. You can actually set it aside for a moment and come back to it and feel it and process it.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to add that in.
No, thank you. Thank you for doing so, because we've had conversations on this podcast before where we're really encouraging dads, because men have this knack of like, oh, I don't have to feel, but they feel. And it's okay to feel, and it's okay to be in that moment where, I love that you said feel the feelings and understand where you're at. This isn't some like soft kumbaya type stuff. This is like, I love what you said before, the systematic approach to saying, okay, where am I at? What am I feeling? This is okay. Now let's move on. Just be in control of that situation by learning through that. And I know that's what you do. You help adults do this with kids. Um, Now your parenting program, it's innovative. So what sets it apart from maybe some of these other supports that people would find, or the guys listening to this might find in their community?
It's a couple of things. I mean, as I mentioned the word complexity before, I really do try to make it as direct as possible,
Mm,
because I think your life is already so complex. So trying to process complex new directions, and it just feels unattainable. So making it really clear, really direct, really repetitive almost, which is why I narrow it down to 6 strategies and perspectives.
mm,
Because what I do is I teach the process of trying to figure out what to do, like, to find solutions to whatever the issues are. So it's really important. So even when I'm helping a parent in particular, because I think I mentioned to you, part of the program is a group coaching program.
yeah,
And I love the group element because I really feel it accelerates the learning, because parents are listening to other parents' questions, and some of them they didn't even think to ask.
yeah.
Sometimes a parent will be, can I ask a follow-up to somebody else's question?
Okay.
But every time we try to help the parent solve the specific problem, I then generalize it for how we can apply that to other things. This is the process we're going through. And parents can go over and over the process and build what I call their problem-solving muscles.
Problem
So
solved.
that's one big distinction. And then another is really the support. I think there's a lot of autism education out there. I happen to think mine is really good, but there's a lot of good education out there, right?
Mm,
But if you have a hard time applying it to your child, or you apply it as best you can, but there's nowhere to go back and say, this didn't work, how can I do it differently?
yeah.
It leads a lot of parents to try a lot of things and come out the other side saying, nothing works for me, nothing
Oh,
works.
good.
And those things will work. You just have to have the support to have the conversation, to learn the process of figuring out what to do.
So if someone's listening to this right now and they're in that spot where they're like, okay, like we've read the books, we've listened to podcasts, we're listening to Cam's podcast. So these are people who are obviously seeking out information, some input, some support, but they don't know where to start. And you have 6 strategies and perspectives that you go over in your coaching. Can you give us like one or two of them of where somebody could start right now, or something that they can focus on as a kickoff point, a starting point to learning more about what you do?
Well, the first is that model and teach self-regulation,
Yeah.
because just really being aware of that. And then second is that set up for success.
Yeah.
And, the first part is really about understanding that your child is doing the best they can in the moment, which sometimes it's frustrating because sometimes your child could do something yesterday and then today they don't do it. So you think it's a willfulness issue,
Mm.
but the circumstances today are different. I say to my parents all the time, have you ever come home and said, like, we're getting pizza, I can't cook dinner, but
Yeah.
you could cook dinner yesterday, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So those are the first two. I do help parents understand how to set limits and boundaries and enforce them with compassion, right?
Mhm.
Because sometimes the problem isn't, it's the boundary. It isn't, sometimes the problem isn't the child, it's the boundary. You set the boundary in the wrong place and you didn't set your child up for success. And
Yeah.
being flexible about that is something that's really important to learn without giving up and giving in, right? I talk to a lot of
Yeah.
parents who do either like they're really strict on the one side, or they just don't do that because it's too hard. And there's a giant middle ground that is so useful and important to learn.
What you're sharing points to this piece where it sounds like parents that you've had the opportunity to work alongside tend to feel overwhelmed. Like it happens really quickly and it happens in the moment. But I would predict that these little pieces of overwhelm in the moment on a Monday, on a Wednesday, on a Saturday morning build, and they build and they build and they build. How does a parent avoid allowing that buildup to happen to where they're just completely overwhelmed, not in the moment, but just in general, where now the parent's being impacted and they can't function and they can't show up with compassion and flexibility? What encouragement would you have to people who are listening to this who might feel these little bits of overwhelm are starting to build up?
I do think when each moment happens, it is really useful to do a debrief with yourself. What did I do
Mm.
well? What went wrong here? If anything did go wrong, like sometimes
Yeah.
it's just a bad combination of elements, or your child's having a bad day, or you're having a bad day, or allergies are emerging, changes in schedule because it's the end of the year. This is always a hard time of year for parents.
Yeah.
So really just thinking through and not allowing it to build up if that's possible.
Mhm.
And if you have a source of, a friend or someone to talk it through with, sometimes that's, more hurtful than harmful, because people tell you things and you're like, you have no idea about my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. But just, I think you can do a lot of good thinking through on your own. And what I love about the way you described it, there are two things. One is you described exactly what I described to parents about how their children go over the edge from a provocation that's really out of proportion to the meltdown that they're having. But that's
Mm.
exactly, it's always parallel. What we're experiencing is so similar to what our children are experiencing. So I love that element of it. And I love the way you talked about it as a buildup, because one of the things I really do help parents do is break down all of the issues into small pieces, because
Mm.
it's very hard to find a solution to a gigantic ball of problem. You can't even identify the problem. But when we break it down systematically, and it's like a math problem, right? You can
Yeah.
solve what's in the parentheses, but you
Yeah.
can't solve the whole, the whole
Everything at
long
once.
string.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, by the way, because I was working with my daughter on that last night. It's like, no, you got to start here. And that doesn't make sense. It's all in the same line. It's all happening at once. Why can't I just do it all at once? And I love that you're breaking it down. I'm going to go back. I'm going to repeat the 3 things that you said, because I think it's really important for the listener. I'm going to put this in the show notes as 3 key questions to ask yourself in a debrief. What went well? What did I do well? I think it's a great place to start, because acknowledging strengths, and I said, or what did I do better than last time? Even like, what did I do well is really good. What went wrong? So where did this happen? Where did the conversation go sideways? When did I see the behaviors, my behaviors change? And then my kids, they model that. And what's different? And then I love the piece about connection. And sometimes you just need to be connected to a listener, not an input giver. So if you have
Exactly.
some, yeah, if you have somebody who can listen and just be like, tell me more about that. How did that make you feel? Oh, I would believe that would be frustrating for you. Tell me more. Like you need somebody like that in your life, not
Yes.
a, well, you know what you should do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The validation. And it's also, it does help you figure it out, right? Because
Right.
sometimes it stays in your head. It's hard to break it down into the smaller pieces.
Yeah.
Um, Another question I would add to the list of those is why, why did this situation happen?
Mm.
Right. And there are going to be elements of like, why is my child acting in that way? And, with the foundation of compassion, right?
Yeah.
um, what did I miss along the way that I might have been able to address to prevent this? Those kinds of questions. What skills do I need to help him or her learn to help them avoid this in the future?
Such a growth process. I love that question. Why did this happen? Because when you start to ask yourself that, why did this happen? And then 2 days from now, why did this happen? You start to piece together little bits of what's happening in the big picture. It's like a puzzle. And so these little bit, now this is not a puzzle that's ever going to be solved, but it's one that you can look back and reflect, why did this happen? What's consistent, what's the same, what's different, and then how can I break it down into smaller chunks so I can figure out what I can do
Solve
better.
for X, right?
Yeah. Yeah, solve for X. I
Yeah.
like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
I mean,
great.
and I think a really important piece of the question about what did I do?
Mm,
Because you have the most control over yourself, right? So, what could I do differently is such a great question. You don't have to be wrong. Like I always say to parents, you don't have to be the problem to be part of the solution,
yeah, I
right?
love it.
And a lot of times there's a hidden belief in there, like my child should be able to do this, or it's never going to be different, or I have a big day tomorrow and I can't stay up till midnight with this child, whatever the thing is. And sometimes it's that belief that's driving your frustration, and then your frustration is feeding the dysregulation. So,
Yeah,
and that's okay. We're human, we're humaning, feel all the feels, show yourself some grace, right?
yeah,
But just think about it so you might make a different choice next time.
I love it. Everything you're sharing could be used with all kids. Really, like
Exactly.
as parents, this should be common practice for all children. But children with autism are different. They do respond differently. And if there's a parent listening to this who does not have a child who has autism, or a parent who does, what are some of the differentiating factors so people who are listening to this can understand some of the context of why interacting with a child with autism or ADHD or another neurodivergence, how can that differ?
Well, I think children with autism and ADHD tend to have much more sensitive sensory systems.
Mm,
And because sometimes parents don't have the same sensitivities, we have to really be sensory detectives, right? To figure out what's going on, to figure out what might be overstimulating, or what might be, sometimes there's an understimulation. They don't have the same sense of urgency, or, there's fire and they're like, okay,
yeah, it's warm.
um,
Yeah.
right. Another thing that is characteristic of autism, and again, not everybody is the same, and autistics don't have the monopoly on this, but that
Mhm.
is rigid thinking, real rigidity, inflexibility, black and white thinking. Um, and so much of interaction is about collaboration and negotiation. And when you are dealing with someone who is a very rigid thinker, it can be very frustrating.
Yeah.
But so you have to know, and like I said, lots of neurotypical children are this way too. So
Yeah.
it's a useful thing to know.
Yeah.
Um, but you have to know that that's where they're coming from, and they're not being stubborn, they're not being bossy, they're not being whatever the thing is. It's they're not processing the world the same way you are.
Yeah. You're a mom. You've raised they're adults. You've gone through the whole process. But you were a lawyer, you got your master's in education, you were teaching your son, you're helping other people. But as as a parent, what is one thing you learned from the mom lens that is like a really top piece of advice that you say, just as a mom lens, this is my thing that I would share with you?
One big thing, I mean, my mind is like flooding with things. I'll start with one big one.
Yeah.
Focus on now, right?
Mm.
Sometimes we get so focused on the future and worried about the future and targeting, people are like, I have to send my child to the right nursery school or they're not going to get into Harvard. And I think if you make the best decisions for who your child is right now consistently, you get to the highest place you can get to. Whereas allowing that kind of fear and futurizing to impact your today decisions is, you can end up making a less optimal choice.
Yeah, I love it. Focus on now. Speaking of which, focusing on now, as a mom of grown children, what is one area right now that you are excited about diving into, or an area of growth that you're passionate about right now?
Well, my daughter recently got engaged and we're planning a wedding,
Congratulations.
and it's a
Yeah.
whole new, experience, and it's a wonderful experience. She found it such an amazing young man, and we love his family, which makes us very lucky, I know. But it's a whole new role.
Yeah.
I've never been a mother-in-law before.
You'll do great.
Hope
Yeah,
so.
you'll do great. That's exciting. Well, congratulations. It's a big time for your family. So, wish you and your daughter and your new son-in-law all the best as you go through that.
Thank
Andrea,
you.
if there are people listening to this right now who want to learn more about what you do and connect with you, where can they do that?
My website is autismparentsolutions.com. And there you'll find a number of resources and, things that you can learn about me, learn about my process, learn about autism. If you're thinking, I need a coach, and this sounds like it's right for me, you can reach out to me directly at Andrea@autismparentsolutions.com. There is a free training on my website, and if you watch that, it'll lead you to a place to book a call that will tell you more about what the coaching process is like. So all of those ways would be great.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. Andrea, I want to thank you for taking time to spend with us in our community today. And yeah, I look forward to seeing more about your work, and congratulations on the upcoming
Thank you
wedding. I
so
think it's
much.
exciting.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for this conversation.